Welcome to the Easton Fellowship Podcast. My name is Nathan Walton, co-lead pastor of Easton Fellowship, and joining me for today's conversation is Pastor Don Coleman. Don Coleman is one of the founding pastors of Easton Fellowship, and he also served for a number of decades as a community leader and nonprofit leader in the East End of Richmond. Aside from that, Pastor Don Coleman has been a mentor and a father figure for countless folks within Richmond, and I'm excited for this conversation because it's an opportunity to really engage in an under-discussed but really important topic in the church, which is racial trauma. And so look forward to you being able to hear this conversation. All right. Well, I'm excited about this because, I'm excited about this conversation because of the topic, but also because I'm with my pastor. Amen. Pastor Don Coleman, pastor of East End Fellowship. And we've got a lot of cool things to discuss, a lot of heavy topics to discuss, but I think my hope is that this conversation helps to free people and to heal people and even helps us as we in our own processing with this. Yeah. And so we're going to be talking quite a bit about trauma and in particular racial trauma. Mm-hmm. And I always think it's really helpful when having any type of conversation that's dealing with either heavy topics or complex topics or topics that have, where there are multiple views on those topics. I think it's really helpful to do a bit of definitional work. Okay. And so when I think about trauma, something I found helpful is something that a guy named Kurt Thompson said. He talks about the 3 E's of trauma. Okay. He talks about the event of trauma and the experience of trauma, the person's experience, and then also the effect of trauma. Mm-hmm. And for him, he's like, well, trauma is really about the effect, right? Because trauma is something that you carry it with you. In some ways, it stays with you and leads to this ongoing kind of wrestling and grappling. And, there's so many different types of trauma, whether we're talking about, personal trauma or collective trauma or historical trauma or, generational trauma. And so trauma is a big topic. And but we're going to kind of focus it a little bit in this conversation because we want to be thinking about racial trauma in particular. Right. In other words, in what ways have issues of race been the agents of trauma? How's that interconnection happen for folks? And I know that you've been processing your own journey and kind of thinking about a lot of these topics, especially really recently. And I'm curious for you, like when or how did racial trauma become a part of or when did you realize it was a part of your story?
Interestingly enough, even as you were just talking about, I guess you said the 3 E's of trauma, mm-hmm. and all of that, anytime somebody talks to me like that about trauma, that's when I also, it just comes back to me like, I'm really just embracing that what I've been experiencing is racial trauma. Yeah. I for a long time, I've been doing work cross-culturally amongst the races. I grew up in busing and all that. So I've been dealing with racial stuff a long time. And, then I've also been like this radical follower of Jesus, and John 17, that they should be one and all of that. So my whole approach to racial healing and mm-hmm. working together across culture and all that, I can't say I was like realizing that some of the stuff that was happening was actually traumatizing, and so I would have to say now probably about 2019. Yeah. I started, I want to say I maybe heard the term and I was like, that's interesting. And I Googled it and I ended up at the University of Georgia Department of Psychology and it said, oh yeah, racial trauma is a thing, and I was like, oh my, this must be what I'm experiencing and I've been experiencing and I didn't even know it. And so that began the journey. At least I wasn't crazy that my feeling, my anguish, all that stuff, it was real. Yeah. That I had been wounded. Again, I'm saying these words, but back then those weren't the words I was using. I was just navigating it, as a Christian, praying, Lord help me. But I hadn't touched the scientific therapy and all that aspect of that, that racial trauma was an actual thing. So that's what I'll say.
Did you feel like, growing up or just in life, do you feel like the church had given you any tools to interpret or to understand what
Well,
was.
well, see, that's the other part of this that I feel like I'm even just now starting to be honest about the reality of I, I walk by faith and not by sight. I mean, that's what I knew. That's what I was taught. Trust God, believe God, and even to some aspect, almost kind of denying certain feelings because that was a lack of faith. And I'm just being real. At 63, it's kind of sad. I'm starting to like, no, God is like okay with you navigating and admitting, that certain experiences and feelings that you're having are authentically impacting how you relate to others, how you relate to yourself, and even how you relate to God. But yet, on the other side, now in this, I've been at this now for a few years, and now I'm coming to this place of resiliency where I realize, like, no, but my faith is actually how I'm going to get through this. And that was what was cool about when I discovered this racial trauma stuff on the University of Georgia. Was one of the things they had down as a way to navigate racial trauma was prayer. And I was like, oh, that's how I've been getting through this is because of my prayer life. So I can say that the church taught me to pray now. They didn't mess I was blessed that I was one of the people that I took prayer very seriously. And when I look back now as I'm getting educated around racial trauma, all those years I was able to navigate it without imploding
Yeah.
was really because of my prayer life. I firmly believe that.
Wow. So we're going to come back to that point because I think it is important for us to get to kind of this question of, what are the actual practices that help us to cope with this, right?
Yeah.
But I'm also thinking about, let's say someone is listening to this conversation or watching it, and this is a foreign concept to them, and they're wondering, how does someone even, what leads to racial trauma? Like, what would lead someone to experience that? And the reason why I mention that is I think about events that someone can go through that can lead to racial trauma, and then I also think about the trauma of just living in America and the systems we inhabit and kind of the ongoing impacts of those systems. And I'm curious for you, if someone were to say, hey, like, where did the racial trauma come from? Like, how would you even describe where it comes from?
Wow, that's an interesting. But for my personal testimony, I began to press deeper with the Ahmaud Arbery situation, and I saw constantly they were showing a picture of him in his high school like graduation tuxedo, bow tie, dark skin like me, and I was like, that could have been me. And then I realized, like, well, wait a minute, that is me. I have experienced not being murdered, but I definitely have experienced being treated unjustly because of the color of my skin. And for me, as a person of faith, okay, I always press myself to like, no, I forgive. I'm gonna press through. But that in that moment, the way I began to acknowledge that it was traumatizing was just that actual epiphany, like, oh, this has impacted me. And realizing that for a lot of years, I was just pressing through it. I wasn't stopping to say, no, this is because of race. I'm feeling this because of my race. And I can't get away from it. I'm Black every day. That's how that goes. But for me, the other part that was challenging was I also recognize, for me, my faith made my primary identity was I was a follower of Jesus. And so the tension of those two, that's the process I'm in now in navigating racial trauma, is admitting that even as a Christ follower, a lot of where I was traumatized has even been within the church. And for me, the level of frustration I was starting to have kind of triggered me to awaken to, wait a minute, something's deeper going on here that needs to be healed. And then that's when it was like, oh, it's because you experienced racial trauma. You've been traumatized. You need to be healed.
Mm, mm. Thank you for being so honest about that. There's a guy, you might have heard of him. So Bessel van der Kolk wrote this book called The Body Keeps the Score, right? This book on trauma.
Yes.
One of the things he says, he talks about how he describes dissociation as the essence of trauma. And so what that makes me think about is how, like, for some folks, when they experience trauma, they might kind of emotionally detach from the trauma or become numb to it in some way.
Yeah.
But then on the flip side, I feel like there's some folks who, when they experience trauma, like, they actually feel more intensely. Like, I think about James Baldwin when he says that to be black in America and to be relatively conscious is to be in a state of rage all the time, right, or almost all the time, right? So it's like some people respond or cope with it through the numbness, not even consciously all the time, and some people cope with it through kind of an intensification of feeling, right? And it can, and it might manifest as rage. And
and that's that's one of the things that happened to me.
Yeah.
Is I began to notice the rage.
And
I was blessed to read this book by this lady, Sheila Wise Rowe, Healing from Racial Trauma. And she was listing out these words. And one of the words she listed was rage. And I was like, oh my, that's me, And again, as a person of faith, I was always dealing with the rage from the perspective of, no, that's not of God. I need to squelch that down. Versus, no, this is because of the trauma I've experienced racially. And for me, a lot of my work has been within the white evangelical church and me being the black guy, just owning like, no, I'm enraged because I've been treated a certain kind of way for a long time.
Yeah.
And I've seen a lack of my brothers and sisters, them taking this as serious as they need to take it in order that healing could happen. But myself, I had to own it first. Like, what you're doing is traumatizing me. And I'm enraged. And I remember I lost it with a white friend of mine. And that got my attention because her husband was listening and he was like, what the heck is going on with that guy? Because she knew me. She knew, like, that's not Don, what he just did. And that's, again, I began to process, like, whoa, I've got to deal with this rage and allow God to help me deal with it. But name it, and it's rooted in the fact that I've experienced racial trauma.
Wow. I think that, well, first, thank you for sharing that, because I think, like, that's so real, because in some ways, like, if you haven't dealt with what you've been wrestling with and what you've been carrying, like, the rage is kind of like, it has to go somewhere, right? The energy has to go somewhere. And so it's a question of, like, what does it mean to channel that in a way that can bring healing? But also, what does it mean to just be honest about what's actually happening, right? Because I think that's the other area, I think, in churches and just in society where we can struggle. We struggle with, I'll speak for us as men, we struggle with being honest about what we're actually feeling and what we're carrying, and we mask those things over, right? And so, yeah, I mean, kudos to you and to Jesus for being able to kind of name that and to see it for what it was. But then to also try to figure out, like, how do I release that, right? And
well, I think one of the ways that for me now, the way I release it is I'm also warning my friends. Like, look, there's a possibility that I could go ballistic, but I want you to know why that's, because I'm dealing with this thing, rage, that's associated with the work I've been invested in most of my life with this racial healing. But now I need you to understand and show me some empathy that if you see it, that he's okay. Well, let me not immediately judge him. Let me have some empathy for he's now releasing that, like you were saying, because I can't carry it anymore. And it's been really cool also to watch some of my friends go like, man, Don, I didn't know, man. I didn't know.
Yeah.
You know, and now they're like, I get it.
Yeah.
And they don't know when they say that, that's actually helping me release the rage. Because it's
Yeah.
like, oh, okay, you're not judging me, that I'm telling you that this rage is rooted in the racial experience that I've had.
That is such a, thank you for saying that, because like I've seen a counterexample, you know, someone who I know who, someone who's black who had a white friend, and they thought that their relationship was such that they could actually be honest about what they were experiencing, you know, following George Floyd and all this stuff. And then they realized like, oh, like they ran into a certain fragility on the white person's part, because they were like, oh, I thought we could just talk about surface level stuff. Why are we always talking about race? Whereas for the black person, they were like, oh no, this is a sign that we can be honest with one another, that we can have these types of conversations, because race is a part of my story, right? And so I think it's a great thing when you can engage with someone and they are, it's a trusting enough relationship that they are able to kind of bear that, and just they don't have to have all the answers, but to at least be able to allow you to be authentically yourself, right? I think that's, I just wish that more for for churches, but also for our culture, that we would be able to have those types of honest conversations in ways that don't lead to defensiveness or us feeling threatened by the other person's honesty, right? Like that to me is hard. But there's something else I think is often hard, because I feel like part of what happens with a lot of trauma is there's a certain type of inner unrest, right? Because you're always, you can't necessarily even turn it off, right? There's a guy, oh gosh, what's his name? Cal Spears, who's a therapist. He has a podcast called I think it's Truth Trauma Theology, and he describes trauma as a lack of Sabbath on the inside, right? So like there's this unrest that you carry with you, and you know, when I think about that, I think about this notion of racial fatigue, right? This unrest. Like, what has been the role of racial fatigue, and have you experienced that, and how have you navigated, if you've experienced
Well, again, here lately, because I've heard that language. And again, it was like an epiphany to me. Like, oh, that's what I've been feeling, is the racial fatigue. And then again, because now I've got language for it and I have an understanding, to be able to, again, to communicate that to people, like, hey, you know what? Right now, I'm exhausted with this. Can we not? You know, can we step back in this conversation? Or I warn you, like, you want to keep talking about this? Okay, but I'm letting you know, this fatigue may not allow me to operate with the level of compassion I may need to, or you may need in this moment, because I'm racially fatigued. And then again, the beauty is when you can say that to someone, they can hear that and they lean in with you, like, well, okay, Don, I understand why you need to step away. Okay, thank you for that. Because I mean, I'm excited. I'm so glad you invited me to do this, because this is healing me, like we kind of said it when we started. Because this is helping me, because I'm embracing all of what this recent experience of getting the right language to then navigate this stuff I've been experiencing for years, but now I can give it language. And so racial fatigue is one of them. Like just being owning, like, I'm exhausted because I'm constantly trying to help people navigate this race stuff. And be honest, I'm not seeing them put in the same kind of effort. I'm actually not seeing them, like, they're exhausted, because they're not doing it as much as I am, because I'm invested in moving us towards healing. If we're going to be in a relationship, I want to move us towards healing. So I want to talk about it. But then when I'm fatigued, I've got to know when to stop. And that's that, owning that racial fatigue is a thing that I can use to say, I'm fatigued right now. Let's not talk about this.
Yeah. I think it's such a helpful practice. And I guess what I long for is, like, what does it mean to have a community where it's normalized that we can be honest about that, and normalized that people are going to receive that well, right? Like that to me is like, how do we do that? because I do think, a question I have in my head is like, how bad do we really want community? How bad do we really want relationship? And how bad do we really want to be unified, especially within the church.
I agree.
Because, there's a phrase that Brandy Miller, who does another podcast, Reclaiming My Theology, she uses, which is toxic positivity, right? And that makes me think about the ways that we can be so beholden to wanting everything to be nice and tidy, right? Because Jesus is good, God is good, every day is a Friday. Anyway, sorry. Lots of thoughts about that. But, like, we don't want to be real sometimes because being real feels uncomfortable. And so how we as specifically as faith communities, how do we move to a place of being able to normalize honest conversations about these pains and these wounds, and to do that in a way that doesn't make us feel defensive, feel fragile, shut down, blame the victim, right? Like, yeah. And this isn't just a question for you; it's a question I have for the church in general. But how do we normalize this level of honesty so that we can move from honesty to actual healing?
Right. Well, you just said it. How do we normalize it? How do we own the fact? Again, even as Christ followers, it talks about Jesus says we pursue a peace that surpasses understanding. So there is an aspect of having to press through when there's not peace, that we have to press through to get to that peace. And the part of how we do that is that we stay at it. Now, we just talked about what? Fatigue. So there is a moment when you're fatigued, we stop. We take a break. We move, and now I'm in a stage where I'm moving a lot towards learning more about how to be more resilient. Okay?
Yeah.
But I love the word normalizing, that we got to have these conversations. We got to have these moments where a person can get to fatigue because they were actually pressing towards it, versus, like you said, this foolishness of, oh, everything's fine. No, it's not. No, it's not. And until we, especially the people of God, are courageous enough to actually see someone get healed, and see, that's the story I'm operating in now. I want to be healed. I don't want to just navigate constantly dealing with racial trauma. I want to move towards being healed, and then also being a person that's able to help other people move towards healing. And so I love that. How do we normalize it in a community that we're going to have these conversations? We're going to press through. We're going to experience racial fatigue. We're going to have all those things kind of happen, but we're not going to stop. Why? Because we want to see people be healed. And why? We want to see there be authentic peace and real community that transcends just putting on.
Yeah. It's, to me, when I think about that, I think about, like, what it means to have a vision for what could be.
Yeah.
Right. Like, I was watching an interview with a guy who experienced a lot of childhood trauma, and he says, "I've been broken for so long, I don't know who I am well." And, like, when we carry trauma with us, and that, it's such a big part of our story, and it feels like a part of our identity. So, like, it can be hard to even get the imagination for, like, oh, things could be different. Or for a community, right? To think, like, oh, if we really leaned in, this is what this community could be, right? This is the testament to the gospel that this family of believers could be in particular. So, like, to me, I think that question of vision is really important. Like, what does it mean for us to have a vision when so much of our society is actually littered with the effects of trauma, even though we don't name it that?
Yeah.
And so then what's normalized is the trauma. We feel like, oh, that's just the way it is, right? Or that's just the way that our parents have all, everybody's like that in our family. Or, and in reality, it's like, no, the gospel actually means that those things don't have to have the last word on our stories, right? And so it gives us this counter narrative.
Yes.
But it's like we are being called to live into something that a lot of us haven't ever experienced.
Yes.
And so, what is the role of vision? Like, how do we cast a vision for people such that, because it's hard to want what you can't see, right? So, how do we help people to get a vision for, here's the type of community we could be, or here's the level of emotional health I could be experiencing,
Right. Yeah.
when we become just, not by choice, but just by the society, we've normalized the status quo, which is unhealth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, just sitting here talking to you, man, that's what's getting me excited, because you're younger than me, and so hopefully you're gonna be around longer than me. But that's it. You got to keep pressing towards the intentionality of, we're not going to settle for this. I think for our local church, that's been part of our issue, is that people got to some level of fatigue, and they just like, okay, let's stop talking about this. And we said, no, we got to keep talking about it because people are still suffering through it. So we want to keep moving towards finding a place where all of us together are like, yes, we can see something greater than our trauma. But the only way we're going to get there, we just have to stay at it. And then, you say a simple word like love, but that's the end of the day. At the end of the day, if you're in pain and I'm telling you you can't talk about it, how much do I really love you? And that's the challenge. That no, if when you tell me you're in pain, I had a friend of mine, and when we were going through some stuff, and I said, man, you hurt me, and that's when he was like, man, hey, oh, whoa, Don, I didn't know I was hurting you. I'm like, yeah, but what happened for me was, why don't I just tell people that hurts, and that's what I'm seeing now around racial trauma. I'm being more free to say, no, man, that what you just said, that was super painful to me. It's almost like you don't it's almost like you don't even notice that I'm a person of color. I'm a black man in this space. It's like that don't matter to you. And when hopefully it'll click. Sometimes it clicks for people, other times they look at you like, is there a problem? And so to push the vision forward, even before you, because you're talking about vision, I just think we have to keep moving. And again, I think you're doing a good job of grasping language that then can cast vision before the vision actually is clear. And that's what I even think this whole series is about, is the fact that we're doing this series, to me, is saying to our people, we're going to keep moving towards healing by naming the trauma, naming it's hard, and naming that we're not giving up.
Yeah, that amen to all that. And we talked about this a little bit last night, but as I think about this idea of healing, like, being healed requires facing the actual trauma, right? And
Yeah.
Last night we were talking about the story in Numbers chapter 21, right, where the people of Israel disobey God, grumble against Moses, and all these things, and God sends these serpents, and people are dying and being hurt, and then God tells Moses to put up this bronze serpent and says, "Look at the serpent. Anybody who looks is going to be healed." Right? And so God is telling them to look at the symbol in some ways of what has been traumatizing them.
Yeah, that's crazy.
And then you fast forward to John, chapter 3, where Jesus is referencing that and says that even as the serpent was lifted up, so the Son of Man will be lifted up. And then he says, "For God so loved the world," right? That he gave. And so it's like, it's both that the source of our, or the image of the trauma is actually the way, like facing it as the way to become healed.
Yes.
And the way Jesus kind of frames it is like, it's also looking at Jesus. Like, he is the source of our hope and our healing. And so that's just fascinating to me, because I feel like part of what we need then as churches is to say, how do we actually face these things? And to me, what you said around even being able to tell someone, hey, what you just said, like that hurt me, or what you did hurt me, like that's like a micro way of saying, I'm going to face this pain and name it. I'm not going to let it fester. I'm going to be honest about it.
There you go.
And, the macro ways are us being able to name that when we've experienced, other forms of trauma in our society. But like, something I wonder is like, so how do we become courageous enough to be willing to face those things, and then be willing to like actually name them in the context of folks that we hope we can trust. And then what do you do when people don't respond the way that you need, right? Like, how do you not, like, so for example, if you say, hey, like, here's what I've been carrying, and they don't respond positively, like, what does it mean for us to not become bitter as a result of that?
Right.
But because that can then become its own source of trauma, where I bore my soul, and they couldn't even pray with me.
Right.
They couldn't be with me.
And
so
again, that to me is where authentic faith has to kick in. And again, in my process right now, that is a huge part of my process, is that I still have to love those who, when I'm bearing my rage, when I'm sharing with them they hurt me and they don't respond the way I think they should respond, the Christ in me has to arise and realize, oh, I still get to love them. Because most likely behind whatever they're doing to me is some trauma they've experienced that I might not even know about, that their response to me is coming out of that.
Yeah.
And so now what my love can do in responding to them in love when they are responding to me out of their trauma is maybe that might be the thing that breaks something in them to see like, wow, I just treated Don he told me I hurt him and I responded as if that didn't matter to me. That could click for them if I can model to them that no, but I'm still going to love you. I'm not going to break relationship with you because of that. But I'm just being vulnerable here. That's what's going on with me right this moment. Yeah. Is I want to like, yes, I want to love the way that Jesus loved. And we know he said crazy stuff like, you're actually supposed to love your enemies. And to acknowledge like, really? I want to do some gymnastics around. No, he didn't really. No. Love your enemies. And allow that, I'm marinating in that, of course, most of the people that I'm engaging with actually aren't even my enemies. They're fellow believers.
Well, that's why the pain's so hard. Yeah.
So, okay, I'm going to find a way to keep loving you. Yeah. And I'm going to find a way to keep loving while I'm saying it's hurting. And that's, to me, that's again where the love of Jesus comes in to get me through that. To know that I'm loved by Christ is what gets me through that. Yeah.
Well, it's crazy because like part of what I'm thinking about in light of what you're saying is what it means to catch a vision for how God sees us, right? That we are actually loved by God, but also how God sees these other people, right? Wow. Because part of what you named is how you could be experiencing trauma and you might share it with someone, they may or may not be able to handle it, but in reality, they are carrying their own stuff, right? And it can be easy to, demonize them for not being able to bear the weight of what your story is. But in reality, like, they're going through trauma of their own. It's a different type of trauma probably. But it's like, what actually needs to happen is we need to be free to say what we need to say to become healed. And that needs to be a catalyst for someone else's healing too.
Yes.
If they're willing to allow that, right? And so but I just think that's a really helpful point because I do think when we're dealing with our own stuff, right, and it's valid stuff, right, it's really easy to have no empathy for anybody else.
That's good, Pastor.
But when God looks at us, God actually sees the mess that all of us are in, all of us have, and God is still big enough for all of it, right? And that doesn't mean that we have to fix other people's stuff. Come on. But it does mean that we have to recognize that we're all actually humans who all need Jesus.
Yes.
And that's a hard pill to swallow because it feels a lot better to be able to say like that person just doesn't get it. There you go. They're the problem, and they could be part of the problem. but it can be tied in with a little bit of self-righteousness.
Come on.
So how do we? It's like how do we remain humble even as we're being honest about what we need to process with?
I'm encouraged that I'm on this podcast. Because I just believe, again, it's a validation that in our little tribe, we're trying. We're trying, and I believe that the Spirit of the Lord, and we've seen it here a few times in some of our gatherings, like when like, okay, God has given us an extra dose of something to get us through this, and you can't explain it. But I believe it's in response to the fact that we keep positioning ourselves that no, we're gonna find a way to keep loving one another, and then God gives you something supernatural that you go like, whoo, and not everybody, but a good majority of the people in the room go, okay, God, you just did something that saying you're affirming that we need to keep pursuing loving one another.
Yeah. Well, in light of that, I feel like the church has, in many ways, been the context of racial trauma, right, and the cause of racial trauma. Yeah. But in some ways, it's been the context of racial healing.
Yeah.
At the same time, it's just,
time.
Same body of Christ. And in light of what you just said, like what gives you hope and what sustains your hope that the church can move from being a place of causing trauma to being a context for the healing of trauma?
I keep being blessed to encounter people who are sincere in their pursuit of Christ, who are authentically willing to speak the truth to one another in love, and who are willing to humble themselves and really have empathy for one another. I've been blessed, to experience that, to experience, like I said, my friends, when I started to come more open with my racial trauma, just having people come alongside of different race who was like, no, Don, I'm sorry, man. It breaks my heart. I didn't know you felt like that. And to me, the beauty of coming out more about my racial trauma, people realizing like, oh, I thought you were good, bro. I didn't know you being the only black guy in the room was causing you pain. Yeah, especially when I've been doing it for like 20 years. And I'm trying to figure out, well, why you ain't got more black friends than me after all these years? And to have to say that, I remember I was sitting on my porch and a young man came to me, and it was right after the George Floyd stuff. And he came, he said, Don, Don, I just want you to know, bro. Just want you to know, man, I feel it, man. I feel the pain you're going through, man. And I just had to come and tell you. And I said, oh, okay. Do you have anybody else black that you could go to like this? Basically, he just about started weeping. I said, man, I ain't trying to hurt you, but I'm telling you, that's what we're dealing with. It just can't be me. You gotta press yourself to have more relationships. And that was freeing for me, number one, to say that to him. But I know it did something for him to go like, yeah, I can't think this is gonna be fixed because I got one black friend. And that type of thing, man. I've seen enough of that to keep giving me hope, that, okay, when you share stuff like that, somebody receives it and then they go and make application. I've seen enough of that to keep giving me hope. And like I said, I'm in a moment right now of a tremendous resiliency, where I'm feeling like, all right, let's go. And this podcast is like, I'm just so excited about where we're going, because it's just the world is going further and further apart. And so I think it's beautiful that people like us, who are people of faith, who are saying, no, we can see healing from the racial trauma. What the enemy meant for evil, we can actually see God turn it for healing. And I'm excited about being a part of that. And it's also fun for me because I look back a couple of years, I was in some major racial fatigue, and so to now authentically be experiencing this resiliency is a beautiful thing. And it's because I've seen people responding in godly ways to say, yes, let's stay at this.
I love that resiliency piece, right? Like, because earlier in our conversation, you kind of alluded to how resiliency and rest are not mutually exclusive. They're like, sometimes you need a little bit of a break, right? But part of what that break does, it allows you to stay at the table.
There you go. That's it.
But just now, what you kind of connected it to is the fact that this process of remaining resilient is actually a communal effort, right? Because we are holding one another accountable to this in some ways, right? And I'm really curious. I mean, I'm curious for our church, but I'm curious in general how churches can do that, right? How do we actually hold one another accountable, and so that we all stay at the table, right? And it's not just people on an island trying to figure out or trying to gut it out, but we even have communal language around that, right? I'm excited to see. I'm excited to see that happen because I do think part of it too, part of the resting idea isn't even just about us resting; it's about us resting in Jesus, because Jesus is the one who's going to make this happen, right? Because for me, I'm like, oh yeah, when I first think of resilience, I think about the effort, but it's like, oh, actually, without Jesus, none of this matters. Without Jesus, resiliency looks like burning out, right? You're resilient till you're not, right? But God give us hope because of the gospel, right?
He gives us hope because of the gospel. I love it. Yes.
Yeah. Wow. We could probably talk about this forever. What I will say is, I have so many thoughts, but one of the things I've been thinking about is how this topic, I feel like it affects everybody, and there's a way to kind of understand racial trauma as something that affects Black people in particular, or just minorities and that type of thing. But in reality, we are all being shaped by these realities, right? And I think about a quote from James Baldwin. He said that white people are trapped inside a history that they don't understand, right? And this whole idea of like, oh no, all of us are captive in some ways, and which means it's going to take all of us to get all of us free. And I guess I wonder, you kind of spoken to like what it means for someone who's of color who recognizes that they're dealing with racial trauma, and you mentioned some of the ways that you cope with that, but also the ways that you think the gospel kind of leads us to cope with it. What would be your words to someone who's not of color, or maybe isn't even aware of like how people of color have experienced racial trauma? What would be your words to them around how they can, be more empathetic, better understand, be better listeners, recognize its effect on them? Like, what would be your word to people who have not felt like they've been on the underside of the racial trauma?
Yeah, I think you just said it. They've got to decide to position themselves. First, it's to be better listeners. To put yourself in relationships with people of color who are willing to share, and then you listen. Just listen and empathize, and earn the right to possibly ask questions. But don't just jump in asking all these questions, because it's what you call it, exhausting trying to answer all your questions versus you choosing by faith, because especially we're already in relationship, to now allow me to tell you how I really feel, and then you embrace that with empathy by choice. Even before you feel the empathy, you decide, you know what? I'm just gonna hear. I'm just gonna hear what you got to say. And then when you tell me you're in pain, I don't need you to prove it to me. I'm gonna believe that you're in pain. And if I love you, I don't want you to be in pain. And that's definitely, and that's what I say to my friends. And that's what I try to live with my friends. It's like, sometimes you just actually just need to be quiet. I remember I was working with this church, and the young white pastor sent one of his white members to let Don help work with you to help you do better at understanding racial stuff. And I just had to tell the guy, I said, dude, can you just be quiet? Can you just allow the Black people to say what they need to say and don't say anything? Can you try? Could you just try to do that? Well, but I understand what they're going through. I could really speak. No, they don't. They need you to they need to see that you trust them enough to just believe what they're saying. And it's the work, man. It's a discipline for people who've always been in power. And then we got all this stuff. People, they woke. So I get it. Those are the ones who usually
gotta watch.
are the dangerous ones, and I love them because a lot of them are my friends who are woke. It's like, are you woke enough to be quiet though? because that's where the beauty is in when people who have power and privilege actually bring it down and trust their friends when they say, "Look, this is causing me pain. Please."
Yeah. Wow. Are you woke enough to be quiet?
Yeah.
And to me, I also feel like there's another common response in those situations is like, oh, you hear someone explain what they're going through, and then you want to be the savior to fix it, and you don't really sit with them. You actually aren't listening to be
Yeah,
with them.
yeah,
You
and
know.
that, like you said, with all kinds of trauma, I know that I have a tendency. You wanna. Well, let me tell you how to fix that. Just trust the Lord. When God is like, no, you just need to hear what they're saying. Just be quiet. Let them share their trauma experience, and they're just sharing their experience. They're not asking you to fix it. They got to get it out,
Yeah.
and so that's been powerful for me. I heard this story. It's always been helpful for me. But a guy, um, his power was off, you know, and he was like, "Man, what am I gonna do? My power was off." And a gentleman who was his friend came by and said, "You know what? I don't have the resources to get your power turned back on. But you know what I can do? I can sit with you here in the dark until we figure it out together." And, that's been really, really helpful to me. Like, sometimes people just need you to sit with them.
Hmm. Wow. Wow. Amen. Amen. So you've kind of mentioned the journey that you're on. You've talked a bit about that, and we talked a bit about the church. But I kind of want to bring it back to you.
Okay.
Imagine yourself a year from now, a year further in the healing journey. Yeah, how do you see yourself? Like, how do you envision yourself a year from now as you've continued to walk this walk? And yeah,
I really see myself encouraging people to have the conversations, to just what we just embrace, practicing being quiet, and for people of color, embrace being honest without being vicious, but speaking the truth in love about what you're experiencing, what you've been going through, and then allowing our white friends to be able to like hear and then choose to like, I want to be a part of seeing this go forward. And I want to be able to 2 years from now to still have the energy I'm feeling right now. I mean, this whole thing around resiliency, it really I'm involved in stuff around the city, and I'm believing like, you know what? We're getting closer to breakthrough than ever. Now, let me tell you why. Because I believe on a larger scale, it's going to be so obvious that people are going to be believing division is the only way. And so they're going to be looking for somebody who says, no, I believe we can find peace, that we can come together. And I believe that because of my faith, because of this Jesus and what he has done. Those of us who say we're his followers can no longer be the perpetrators and facilitators of racist foolishness. No, we've got to come together, and then we've got to demonstrate that. And I'm blessed, to be a part of a local church that I believe we're determined to keep doing that. And so, yeah, a couple of years from now, that's my hope. My hope that I'll be the old dude sitting there cheering y'all on, but also, I love my front porch. People be coming to talk and say, hey, yeah, I want to do better at living in racial healing, because that's the other thing. We didn't talk a lot about that, but I love the word healing because it's ongoing. It's a process. It's not over. And I'm like I say, I got my mojo back, man. I believe that Jesus prayed that we would be one. And why not? Why not us? Why not? Why not? So yeah, I'm excited about staying at it, and resiliency is the way you stay at it. but you alluded to it in a beautiful way, to not a resiliency that burns you out, but a resiliency that's finding hope because you're seeing hope come. You're seeing people actually change. And again, that's what I sense we're experiencing some of that even now, where you're getting hope because you're seeing people awakening who kind of hadn't seen it before.
Amen. Amen. Well, thank you so much for everything you shared. My hope is that this continues to bless folks in the same way it's blessed us in this conversation.
Yeah.
So thank you. Thank you. And that's a wrap.
All right. That's a wrap. Thank you, Pastor.